welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of this day here on the show, I do want to remind you yet again that if you want to interact with the show more directly, consider leaving a tip or donation through the $sign on your screen on YouTube, or just leaving a question, comment, or concern you might have throughout the show about any topic I bring up. I would love to hear your opinion on it. It's a great way to help the show expand. Also, if you feel so inclined, do it with my fellow podcasts because they are doing their own thing very well in their own rights. But without further ado, let's get into our second segment of the day here on the show, addressing the waiver wire a little bit here. And it's getting a little bit more clear-cut in terms of who we know potential superstars and who we know are deep sleepers here. And the list that I compiled is a mixture of both, but I don't really know how I would view the waiver wire as someone telling you who to get in that regard. This segment is starting to feel more like we're reviewing guys who have either made this list a couple of times or who are seeing performances out of that we really don't know how to navigate through, because they're in very interesting situations, all these guys that I talk about in my waiver wire segment. But without further ado, I'm just going to go right into it and see what you guys think about this, because it is a very weird thing to navigate when you're playing fantasy football, the waiver wire. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. The first guy that I want to mention is a guy who I was very high on coming into the year, a guy who I actually personally drafted in my fantasy draft, but decided to let go, I believe, after a couple of weeks because he didn't really factor into the Chargers' plans that much. But now that their second option, Gus Edwards, is on the IR, he could potentially play into their game plan a little bit, and that is Kamani Vidal. He had a decent game through the air, actually, getting a receiving touchdown, 13.1 fantasy points, his first receiving touchdown of any kind in his NFL career. Granted, though, he is still seen as the third back in that system. And for what it's worth, there's no way you're taking away, say, 5 to 10 J.K. Dobbins touches for the sake of just incorporating a rookie. But when he's on the field, I feel like you can utilize him in so many different ways just because of the fact your running game and ground game in general is so potent with Dobbins. As we saw, he did get that receiving touchdowns. Maybe in the future, he could be a situational back on passing downs, because the value he could add in terms of creating an even more versatile side to their running game could be vital for the Chargers going forward, because at some point they're going to have to find ways to win games against superior opponents, especially in the AFC West. And if they want to be a viable contender for, at the very least, a wild card spot in the AFC. And so I think that Kamani Vidal is not a pretender in terms of someone who ends up on the waiver wire and you might want to go out for. If you pick him up, he will have decent production for you. It's just a matter of when the Chargers are facing teams that they need him for, rather than just week in, week out consistent production, and also factoring in the fact that Gus Edwards will eventually come back and he could be a bigger part of situational downs for the Chargers offense. So Kamani Vidal is just someone who I wanted to mention as a guy who I think could potentially be viable. We still have to wait and see based off his other performances. And then going over to the quarterback position, I kind of want to analyze more than out and out say these guys are some people who you might want to pick up in the waiver wire. These are two rookie quarterbacks making their respective debuts for their teams. Very similar performances, actually. Drastically similar performances. And I feel like I don't know how to take stock from them just because one of them's not going to play for that much longer, and the other is in a situation where we don't necessarily know how he's going to look week in, week out. So we'll start off with the first of the two, Spencer Rattler. He's a guy who, coming in as a replacement for Derek Carr because of the injury, and not for nothing, looked kind of decent for what it's worth. He was a guy who was actually seen as a first-round prospect early in his college career because of all the transfers, going from Oklahoma to South Carolina, and now here with the Saints, kind of as the backup and now being thrust into action. He never really got a long look at by, NFL fans or fans who follow these kids from their college careers. But he did have an interesting debut, 243 yards total, 1 TD, 2 interceptions, 12.42. And I feel that the reason why I feel that he's either going to be a player who's more than serviceable as a backup or a guy who is going to find it very difficult to keep the Saints in contention in the NFC South is because I don't really know what to think about how the Saints offense can account for their offensive weapons. Because either they're hot or they're cold. And right now they're too in between for me to really rely upon someone stepping up instead of just relying on Spencer Rattler full time. There is one guy we're going to mention later in this segment that I'm kind of excited about, but in terms of excitement surrounding Spencer Rattler and his fantasy value, I don't think there'll be too much there unless you're in a deeper league and you might want to take a swing on him. But he is someone who warrants a look at just because he's getting a lot of valuable reps in the Saints offense and potentially could project to be the QB of the future for the Saints if he ends up actually over-exceeding expectations. But let's switch to the next guy, Drake May. Very similar performance for New England in a game that everyone knew he was going to be overmatched in, whereas with, the Saints, it was a divisional game, so maybe people actually expected this to be closer, but it didn't end up being close. But I think Drake May had a game that you expect out of him as a guy coming in his first start, playing in that situation. He had a decent game, 243 yards, 3 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, 19.52 fantasy points. So overall, a more comprehensive performance than Rattler's. But what I like about Drake May is that he actually has a more immediate chance to prove himself to his organization. I feel that with Spencer Rattler, it's going to take a little while for people to come around to the fact he might potentially be the Saints quarterback of the future, whereas we know Drake May is going to be the guy in New England. So even though he's kind of being thrown into the fire, he's developing a rapport with his teammates, he's developing a trust in them, and most importantly, he's actually getting first-team reps in critical situations. Now, a lot of people are saying maybe it's too soon to determine that, but I feel like there's no better way to do that than just have him get actual game experience. Because if he just sat for the entirety of the season, chances are next season he would have looked like a deer in headlights no matter who's out there, even if his offensive line was a top 5 unit instead of what it is. So I kind of feel like developing this relationship with his offense, developing a trust with his coaches, leads me to believe that Drake May, potentially in a dynasty league, potentially a couple years down the road, will be a valuable fantasy asset. So these are two guys who I'm kind of leaning more towards future look-ats rather than immediate waiver wire additions. But it does add a kind of certain flair to this segment that wasn't there before, because these are two guys we're going to be closely examining for years to come. Then let's get to some other guys who kind of don't deserve to be on this list based off their name and what we've seen of them before, but some newbies here as well. Start off the guy who has been around a little bit in fantasy, Romeo Doubs. 3 catches, 49 yards, 2 touchdowns, 19.9 fantasy points for the Green Bay Packers in that game against Arizona. And for what it's worth, I feel that Romeo Doubs, yes, has had a kind of weird start to the season with his suspension and the tension surrounding him. But in this Packers receiver room, if injuries continue to be a concern, and Jordan Love is just looking to find the receiver who gets open most often, rather than just, trying to develop a wide receiver one, then why not have Romeo Doubs be someone who is a little bit of everything? He can pretend to be a wide receiver one. He can also project to be someone who's a decoy. As Coda enters the chat, as he asks a question about a dynasty league, would you trade the 3rd overall pick for Jahmyr Gibbs in a dynasty league? Now, actually, Coda, I don't necessarily know if I'm that well equipped to answer this question because I'm not familiar with dynasty league trading. But in terms of just seeing this as, say, a GM trade, I feel like in a dynasty league where you value longevity, I feel like this would be an interesting trade to look into. I don't know how much value picks have in dynasty leagues, but I feel like if you're trying to predict how long a player will succeed in the offense, then Jahmyr Gibbs is someone who's a perfect example. Because think about it. He's in a Detroit Lions offense that for the most part won't change over the next couple of years. He is interchangeable with David Montgomery in terms of how they both fit into the run game for the Lions. Most importantly, he adds a lot of value to them as a receiving back. So if you feel like in the future Jahmyr Gibbs' values and assets to the Detroit Lions adds up to someone worthy of being on your dynasty league for a long time, then by all means, I would go for it. But seeing as to how I'm not as familiar with the whole draft format for a dynasty league, I'm not necessarily certain of how much value a 3rd overall pick could be in helping your team as well. But I feel like Jahmyr Gibbs is a perfect example of someone who could project in the next 5 to 10 years to be someone whose value only grows in the Detroit Lions offense. So it's an interesting proposition. Thank you for it, because it really opened my mind. As just think about rookies next year because he has a 3rd pick for one of them, lots of value. That's a good point. I feel like, though, this rookie class this year is one where it's going to take a lot of time to really see their value. Because think about all the situations where you feel like either a first-round quarterback or, say, a wide receiver will get into. If we look at all the teams that need a quarterback, they're teams that might want them to sit a year or two. Maybe only, say, the Raiders and potentially the Giants are the 2 teams where they would draft a quarterback thinking that he would start right away. So I'm not certain that a 3rd overall pick in a dynasty league right now projects better than what Jahmyr Gibbs could be for the Detroit Lions offense, say, 5 years down the road. That's just my opinion about this. It's a very loaded question, right? Because if, you feel that, say, a Quinn Ewers or a Cam Ward or even a guy at receiver like McMillan or Burden is really that worthy of attention, then by all means, they're perhaps the most interesting project you can get in a dynasty league. But right now, I feel like the Detroit Lions offense is going to be a good one for the time being. And Jahmyr Gibbs is just going to continue to grow into it. But that's just my opinion. But it's a good point you bring up, Andre, in that all of these guys could be projects in the future. In a dynasty league, they could be very valuable. But I do kind of want to get back to kind of round out my waiver wire update. This was something that did get a little bit long. I want to mention a guy who Spencer Rattler actually seemed to have developed a rapport with. How about Bub Means, of all players? In a thin Saints wide receiver room. 5 catches, 45 yards, 1 TD, 15.5 fantasy points. This could be a guy who over the next couple of weeks, as Cody says, thank you for tuning in, my friend. This is a guy in Bum Means who over the next couple of weeks, if Spencer Rattler has trouble developing a connection with any receiver, Bum Means could be the guy. They're fellow rookies, and not for nothing, he's someone who looks like he could be a competent red zone threat for the Saints team who might struggle there. And then the last but not least, Ray Davis. We know his story could be of value to the Bills. Maybe if James Cook comes back, though, he's going to get the majority of touches, and Ray Davis might just be a situational back. But I'm taking stock, a lot of high positive stock in this game from what we saw out of Ray Davis. Let me know what you think in the comments. I will just about do it for this segment. Sorry for going a bit long, but for our third segment of the day here, we're going to be continuing with our positional rankings, starting off with our running backs today, talking about who could stand out in Week 7. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back to talk